I know it's post-lunch, but who's ready for some neuroscience here? Woo! All right, so welcome to Neuroplasticity and Motion, adding cognitive load to boost the brain. My name is Ryan Glatt, and my background is quite diverse. Currently, I'm pursuing a master's in applied neuroscience. I'm a certified brain health coach from the Amen Institute, have a certification in applied neuroscience, a graduate of the Neuroscience Academy. Here's all my body-based stuff. So, as you can see, I either have ADHD or no social life. It's probably a combination of both, but I love education, I love learning, and more specifically, I love neuroscience. And the reason I love neuroscience is because it provides us an opportunity to help our clients and patients on a much deeper level than previously thought. Currently, I work at the Brain Health Center, the Pacific Brain Health Center. It's an integrative medical clinic where we have psychiatry, neurology, neuropsychiatry, and more. We have innovative clinical trials like the prevention trial, which is a randomized controlled trial for 2 years, looking at the effects of a combined multimodal study of combined cognitive physical exercise, nutrition, health coaching, and more. And we just opened last week our cognitive fitness studio, or our CogFit studio, which I'd like to think is the first medical fitness space dedicated to brain health outcomes in the world. This is one of my favorite comics. I've been working out for 6 months, but all my gains have been in cognitive function. Ever since I started personal training when I was 17, I'm 27 now, so it's weird to say I've been in the fitness industry for a decade. But I felt like that was me. And I never had the best luck with hypertrophy. I did have some luck with weight loss, but I always did feel I got something from exercise. I grew up overweight. I grew up playing video games. I never really participated in sports. And when I started to work out, not only did I lose weight, but I started to become more socially adept. I started to do better in school, and I just couldn't really put a name or a series of mechanisms to explain why that was until now. Now, why does this matter? Why do we care about improving cognition or brain health with exercise? Well, brain health needs to be at the forefront of our industry, and I'll explain why. Brain health should be the primary outcome measure and not a side effect. Many of you have heard of the book Spark, which talks about the power of exercise in the brain. And what I've heard is that that book inspired me to study the neuroscience of exercise. And so Dr. John Ratey has done so much for many people, both professionals and the end consumer and the layperson, in describing why exercise is such a powerful tool for improving brain health, mental disorders, mental illnesses like depression and addiction, and also preventing or ameliorating the symptoms of neurodegenerative disease such as dementia and Parkinson's disease. But even after reading that book, a lot of people, especially fitness professionals, didn't do too much differently. They just knew that, great, what I'm doing probably produces some great side effects. But because of the ever-increasing cost of neurodegenerative diseases in our nation, which are much greater than that of pain or obesity, not that those are not big problems, I think that we as a fitness industry, we're focused on the wrong outcomes. I think physical outcomes should be the secondary side effect, and brain health outcomes should be the primary. Your business with your clients only lasts as long as your client lasts. So think about that. We think about client retention. Well, getting them to live longer and have a greater quality of life probably means they will work with you longer. Cognitive decline and neurodegenerative disease is the greatest burden of our time and will continue to be. This is not slowing down, it is exponentially increasing. Everybody has the common fear of losing their minds. Selling people on personal training sessions just because of a fear of falls only goes so far. It doesn't last forever. And hopefully you're getting them better at preventing falls, and so what do we do after that? Twice the population of New York City suffers from cognitive decline. If you do the math, which I'm not very good at, if we say that, nationally there's 300,000 personal trainers, and each personal trainer has an average of about 30 clients at a time, that could be 9 million people that we could impact. Think about that. Think about how many people we could impact if every one of your clients had a brain health plan. What is cognition? You hear about it a lot, but what is it? Cognition refers to mental functions that allow for the acquisition of knowledge and understanding via sensory input, experience, and thought. It primarily refers to the aspects of cognition, at least in this seminar, that are associated with intellectual functions, such as memory, attention, and executive functioning. Cognitive abilities are mental functions that are associated with gaining comprehension through life experiences, thinking, and sensory stimulation. And cognition is more like blood pressure than it is like height. It's not fixed, it's more fluid, and it changes throughout the lifespan. And we'll explore how that happens. Now, this is called the cognitive trajectory of aging. And really, it shows us the different phases of cognitive health throughout the lifespan. Now, as we can see, ideally, we all want to be here. And there's no stopping that decline, just like there's no stopping physical decline. This is imminent. This is going to happen. Your brain and body are going to age and decline. But how fast we do that, or the quality in which we do that, is important to understand. Now, we want to be here. Probably most of us are here, and then most of the world's here. But as we can see, there's a high risk of branching off into MCI or mild cognitive impairment and therefore into dementia. But let's talk about the preclinical phase for a second. And something that's not listed here is subjective cognitive decline, or SCI. You've noticed a problem with your memory, but you haven't gone to the doctor or it's not detectable on tests. That's a majority of us, and it's a majority of the people we work with. Is that correct? That we're not working with a whole lot of people with dementia. Some of you do, but most of us are working with people that do not have dementia, and maybe they have mild cognitive impairment, but we don't know yet, because typically we don't know how to refer, or we do not refer to physicians for that, and we will go over how to do that. So it's associated with changes without measurable symptoms, so subjectively I'm experiencing memory changes. It's a stage where the patient knows, but the doctor doesn't. MCI, this is where cognitive changes are detectable on neuropsychological tests, and there are correlates in brain imaging of MCI, and it's one or more cognitive domains that are impaired significantly. When memory is the primary domain that's impaired, we call that amnestic MCI, and then multi-domain MCI is when we have things like executive functioning deficits, visuospatial deficits as well. But however, activities of daily living are preserved. You're still able to normally go day to day throughout your life. Then we have dementia. There's many subtypes of dementia, which we won't go over, but it includes Parkinson's disease, vascular dementia. Of course, the most popular is Alzheimer's disease. Cognitive impairment is severe enough to interfere with everyday activities. So we have very mild, mild, moderate, moderately severe, and severe. How do we actually assess cognitive decline? Well, the worried well, those that are ourselves and most likely our clients, are most likely to have subjective cognitive impairment. However, less than 50% of these individuals have consulted a physician or a medical professional. So think about half your clients. Think about half those clients having SCI, or subjective cognitive impairment. That is an opportunity to refer them. But have we? Probably not. So we should encourage these individuals to take a baseline test, especially if they are 65 years or older. And that testing can consist of cognitive testing, symptom questionnaires, and/or brain imaging. One of the most common cognitive screeners is the MoCA, or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It's a one-page screener that's ranked out of 30 points. It includes things like a clock drawing task, 3D box representation task, working memory, animal naming, saying the day, the season, the month, the location, things of that regard. Then there's also computerized cognitive assessments, which can take anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes in length on average and test multiple abilities. And then there's neuropsychological evaluation, where you can actually refer, or the physician you refer to will refer to a neuropsychologist, which can implement pen and paper testing, which is more diagnostic and more sensitive in terms of and more valid in terms of the testing. And it's several hours and looks at many specific cognitive domains. From the imaging perspective, we have volumetric MRI, which looks at the size of various brain structures like the hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and memory. It's one of the first areas of the brain that tends to decline with age. And then, of course, amyloid PET, using a radioactive tracer, it looks for amyloid plaques. As many of you have heard, amyloid is that signature protein that is usually accommodating Alzheimer's disease, but does not dictate it. What is the difference between normal aging and Alzheimer's disease? And this could be also other types of dementia as well, like frontotemporal dementia, vascular dementia. But specifically for Alzheimer's disease, since it's the most popular type, a lot of people say, oh, I've been experiencing some memory changes, or I have trouble with memorizing names from time to time, or losing things from time to time. You know, no one says, hey, I'm losing a few neurons. Maybe we imagine that, but they can't sense that. And so these are some of the normal things that occur with aging. So once again, just like you experience aches and pains, and you start to maybe have more muscle loss, and you might have degeneration in your bone structures, while those things can be prevented or slowed, they're bound to happen, and these things can occur with normal aging. Now, the question is, how much can we slow those things or prevent those things from happening until later in life? And then with Alzheimer's disease, it's much more extensive. We have worsened activities of daily living, it's severe and chronic neurodegeneration, so on and so forth. Now, we hear often about neuroplasticity, but I think the mistake we make is we assume that principle applies to the same person regardless of the age. But what happens is, yes, neuroplasticity is available until later in life, well into your 90s, and probably past that, but I'm sure we haven't had enough studies on that, and it's your brain's ability to change in response to experiences. What happens as people get older? They do less. They put forth less effort. Because they have more time and because we're spending more time with them, we should be putting forth more effort to make those changes. Now, this isn't comprehensive, but this is a graph showing that each cognitive ability has its own trajectory. The trajectory is down, but overall, each one has its own lifespan. So some of the cognitive abilities that do occur with aging includes attention. Part of attention is task switching or switching back and forth. That is reduced in aging. Divided attention, the ability to dual task or pay attention or attend to multiple streams of information. Working memory, which is your ability to hold and manipulate information so that it can be stored in short-term or long-term memory. Processing speed, we notice a general slowing in certain functions, visual perceptual abilities, and problem solving and decision making, which are part of executive functions. Now, how can we slow this or improve these? Well, there's something called cognitive reserve, which is sort of like a gas tank for your cognitive abilities over the lifespan. And there's various mitigating factors that can play a role. There's modifiable health factors, which includes exercise, sleep, stress management, education, social support, positive affect, positive emotions essentially, stimulating activities and novel experiences, and cognitive training. My argument is that we can provide every single one of those in a single exercise session. Think about that for a second. Most of the time in the exercise session, the content of the exercise session is based on a physical goal that they came to you to tell you, and the variables reflect the achievement of that physical goal. However, if the variables and the goal was reflective of brain health, we would implement or should implement all of these into a single exercise session over time. We will talk about some ideas for how to do that, but typically we do not do that. So all of us as an industry are missing an opportunity to help these people slow cognitive aging. It's not that you're doing harm because you're getting them to exercise, which is good. And we'll talk about how beneficial exercise is for the brain, but without implementing these things into your session, we are missing out on an opportunity, especially while they're in the physiological states associated with exercise. Now, how does physical activity and exercise affect the brain? Well, there's myriad ways. There's behavioral changes, there's micro changes, and there's macro changes. Behavioral changes includes improvements in cognition and mood, which is primarily what we're concerned with, because it's something that we can objectively observe, and they can feel, and they can see throughout their everyday life. You can also test for those things with some of the testing that we talked about. For mood, there's different questionnaires that can be implemented, and physical activity and exercise itself is a behavior. On the micro level, we have molecular changes like increases in BDNF or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, increases in VEGF or vasculoendothelial growth factor, increases in IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor. Those are molecular changes in proteins that we would consider growth factors that allow us to get to the micro changes. But before we get there, we have to have neuronal changes, changes in the neurons, the synapses, and their networks, both in functional and structural neuroplasticity. And for here, we mentioned neurogenesis, which is the creation of new nerve cells. And then we have structural changes, which could be changes in brain activity or changes in the volume or the size of the brain as a whole or in specific structures. And that way, we have this vicarious cycle that is interrelated to each other. How does the brain actually change? While we hear about neuroplasticity, we typically don't hear about the negative aspects of it. So there's positive neuroplasticity and there's negative neuroplasticity. And here's how neuroplasticity can occur. Neurogenesis, which I just defined as the continuous generation of new neurons in the brain, but on the flip side, there's a continuous death of thousands of neurons every day as well. What we want to do as health professionals is to be able to change the net neuroplasticity, if that was a thing, in the favor of positive neuroplasticity. Then we have new synapses, which is created from new skills and experiences, so they create new connections. So new brain cells, they get connected to, and then we have strengthened synapses, which comes through the repetition and practice and strengthening from neural connections. And so you can see that the connections have been made here, but now those lines are thicker, those connections are much stronger, typically through functional neuroplastic changes, changes in the cell signal or changes in the neurotransmitters associated with the neurons that are connected. Then we have weakened synapses, which are connections in the brain that aren't used and they can become weak. This is what happens when we don't practice or we have negative factors associated with cognitive reserve or negative neuroplasticity. So it can go both ways. Now, the physical activity guidelines for Americans states that 150 minutes to 300 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity exercise per week or equivalent should be performed every single week. This is the minimum required prescription to sustain cognitive and brain health benefits. Now, there have been plenty of studies that people just walk, and it's for less time than that, and they show growth in the hippocampus. So if you get less than this, it's not like you don't benefit, but all of our clients and ourselves should be at least meeting this. I would like to say, according to statistics, less than 25% of people, with personal trainers or not, are actually meeting that goal. So if brain health was the primary outcome measure and the primary goal, this would be our first concern. Now, there's additional benefits for 2 to 3 days per week of strength training, additional benefits for neuromotor training or coordinative training, and of course, additional benefits for stretching, relaxation, mindfulness, breathing, things of that regard. But this is the minimum. So even with being trainers and health professionals, oftentimes our clients are not actually getting there. Sometimes because it's not the goal, or we don't have the behavior change strategies to help them get there, but this should be a priority. Now, looking at some of the micro-level changes, we have the stimulus for exercise, or the stimulus for angiogenesis, which is exercise, and angiogenesis is the creation of new blood vessels. From that, we have increases in cerebral blood flow, or CBF, and then we have healthy angiogenesis, which results in increased capillary density, and is responsive to metabolic demands, which is why it's so important to have a combination of low, moderate, and high-intensity exercise in your exercise programming. And you can also see that some of those connections are thin, but they become thicker. These two are trying to meet for the first time. It's very romantic. Then we know that if we have more VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, more blood flow, it's going to feed the neurons with healthy metabolism so it can grow and function well. Now, a lot of people ask, how long does this take? When we talk about neuroplasticity, what does that really mean? What are the different phases of it, and what are the timelines for it? Well, when you're actually engaging in a new skill or a novel skill, synaptic modification can occur in just milliseconds. Now, it may not be chronic, and it may not be significant, but it's very interesting to know that in just milliseconds, you can make functional changes in the brain. Now, we're doing this all day, every day at various degrees. We just don't think about it, but it really is amazing to think about in just milliseconds you can make those changes. Now, with the branching of synapses and dendrites, which are components of the neurons, you can see that there's less synapses here, those little mushroom-like structures, and then we can increase more, and that takes several hours. Then we have new brain cells, which takes several days, neurogenesis. But on network level changes, where it really makes a difference, it's more significant, because we don't care about one neuron or one synapse. We really care about the networks, because the networks, the specific neural networks, are within different parts of the brain and are thought to be responsible for different cognitive tasks. That takes several weeks and months. So when we have a client that signs up with us for a hypertrophy program, or a weight loss program, or a power program, or a balance program, how long do we think that actually takes? What do we tell them? Several weeks or months, right? So we can't lie to our clients and saying, oh, just one session of exercise, and your whole brain's changing and growing. Well, you may be getting some functional neuroplastic changes, and you will have improvements in mood and acute changes in cognition, but really what we're shooting for is this. But really what we want is this. Higher level brain changes. So when you hear about the hippocampus growing in response to exercise, that's this. That's several months and years. Yes, there are studies showing that in just a few weeks, 12 weeks for example, sometimes even 4 weeks, there can be small changes in the size of the hippocampus, but for more significant and chronic changes to the brain, several months and years. This is the mic drop. At least 80% of gray matter in the brain is modifiable by physical activity and exercise. So if you're sitting here wondering, what's my role in brain health as a health and exercise professional, a health and fitness professional, and you see this, what do you think? Okay, one phrase I might have is, I have the power. I have the power to help my clients implement and adhere to comprehensive multimodal exercise and physical activity programs because of this. Now, there is a debate on this, because this is a collaboration of multiple studies over time, looking at how different studies show that exercise affects different brain structures. But regardless, it's a very motivating thing to hear about, knowing that we can change up to 80% of someone's gray matter in the brain across multiple different regions. But what about white matter? Well, increased cardiorespiratory fitness does that too. And so white matter are these little tracts in the brain that are usually responsible for processing speed. So we have gray matter and we have white matter. What we know happens with exercise is there's greater white matter tract integrity, both in the temporal lobes, where the hippocampus lives, and the prefrontal cortices, where your executive functions live. And the white matter connections between them gets stronger, because as we age, we tend to lose functional connectivity of these brain regions, which overall turns into lessened cognitive abilities and worse performance on activities of daily living. Now let's talk about combining exercise and cognitive training, because that's what this session is about. We know that exercise is beneficial for the brain, but what can we do to enhance what exercise might already do for the brain? This is one of my favorite evolutionary neuroscience models. I know that's kind of a weird thing to have a favorite of, but this one's mine. This is the adaptive capacity model, and it was created by an anthropologist named Dr. David Reichlin and his team at the University of Arizona. And he also released a great paper called Brains and Brawn and how they kind of evolved together. But this model really integrates cognition, exercise, and brain health. So we have caveman hungry, caveman want to hunt. So in order for caveman to hunt, he needs to use his spatial navigation systems and spatial memory systems, which is associated with the hippocampus. In order to navigate his environment, he sees a gazelle. I think that's a gazelle. No, it's a deer? Whatever. I'm not a caveman. I'm not good at this. He uses his... No, I'm not. That's how I started off. I started studying animal behavior, but I had to memorize all these taxonomies. It was traumatizing. He uses his sensory and attention systems, which is through the eye, right? And also through the ears, of course, too. So he has visual attention and audible attention. Caveman has spear. Caveman uses motor control and learning to learn how to use the spear, and needs a lot of accuracy and planning skills to throw the spear correctly while he's running. And then we also have processing speed requirements. As the hunter is stalking around the environment, processing speed is slow, but as he's on the hunt, the processing speed picks up. As the deer starts to go different directions, the caveman has to use his executive functioning for problem solving, cognitive flexibility, decision making, and planning. All of this is happening concurrently. Caveman does not go to gym to bench press in hopes of hunting the gazelle or deer better. Caveman does not go to treadmill to watch TV so he's relaxed before he hunts deer. Caveman does not go to school to learn intellectual functions to hope that translates to hunting deer. Caveman does all at the same time. Audience understand? Very good. Now let's talk about neural hardware versus neural software. Cardiovascular fitness improvements lead to metabolic and neurochemical changes over time, which influences the neural hardware, like the neurons, the hippocampus, the gray matter, the white matter. However, the plot thickens. Cardiovascular fitness hypothesis is not the only explanation for exercise improving cognitive functioning. So this is why, early on, a lot of people were recommending aerobic exercise as the best type of aerobic exercise for the brain. Everyone's heard that? Well, it's because in rat studies, it's the easiest to control for. You have forced wheel running, and you have voluntary wheel running. It's the easiest thing to test for. It's the easiest methodology. And it's also the most popular, because cardiovascular fitness was occurring, and this whole uprising of aerobics started to occur. And I think the translation of that to research was as such. And our industry is a little bit more dynamic and unconventional in terms of functional training now. But we're going to go over some research that's starting to explain what that might do. Now, the cognitive benefits of exercise may also come from the neural stimulus or cognitive stimulus of coordinative and cognitive movement task complexity, which influences the software. So if we meet those minimum requirements, as the physical activity guidelines for Americans outlined, we have the hardware, and we can improve the software, which would lead to improvements in cognition because they're mental functions, they're part of the software, with cognitive movement task complexity and the neural stimulus of coordinative exercise. Very interesting. Typically, what we are not doing is that. Now, some of you are doing that, but you're doing it in a way that's not structured, or you don't know what to call it, or you don't know the programmatic principles around it like you do for hypertrophy, weight loss, and power training. It's not as evidence-based to you, or you don't have the knowledge to execute a specific program for this, which is what we'll go over how to do. Now, what's very interesting is that mental and physical training, or MAP training, as it's called in this study from Shores et al., 2013, we look at no training before. These little red dots are neurons. The white dots are spaces for neurons. This is, of course, it doesn't work like bingo in the brain, but this is a nice representation. So you start with 4, you stay with 4, and now you don't end with 4, you actually lose 2. So that's if you do nothing. So do something. That something should be physical exercise. We start with 4, we get, how many is that, 6? And we end up with 3. So we saved 1 or 2 neurons from dying off. Of course, this is on the level of thousands of neurons, and there's many variables that affect this. Now with mental training, 4, 4, 4. We didn't lose any because we kept them stimulated, but we didn't gain any either. So it changes the software, not the hardware. The neurons are the hardware. They're a part of the hardware. Mental and physical training, ooh la la, start with 4, gain a couple, keep a couple. Very interesting. So that's why I said if you're not implementing cognitive demands during your exercise routines, you are missing out. Mathematically, neurobiologically, you are missing out. Now, how does an enriched environment or environments with cognitive demands help with this life cycle of neurons? Well, with physical activity in enriched environments, the end result is more likely to occur at a higher level with greater number and with greater integrity. So we have rest, proliferation, differentiation, and migration and maturation. We start with stem cells. There's these things called progenitor cells that push the whole thing forward, the whole process forward. We have immature newborn cells, which I've been called that before. And then we have mature newborn granule cells, which is what we're after. Okay, so how do we start to identify techniques that would be more cognitively demanding, as well as modalities that would be more cognitively demanding? Well, there's 2 types of skills you should know about. There's open skill and there's closed skill. Closed skill is what we're probably most familiar with in the fitness environment because it's very easy to control for, not just in research, but you can control for the variables much easier in practice as well. It's more of a static environment. It's usually associated with a fixed apparatus or no object. It's usually conducted in a defined space and a defined time. It's focused on individual performance. There's high inter-trial consistency, so 3 sets of 10 reps. That's predictable. Sequential opposition performance, which basically means that there's not a lot of dynamic interaction with anyone else, and if there is, it's also predictable. And it's usually associated with a single task, push the weight, right? Open skill is what we're after. Not that closed skill is bad, because remember, we just spent half this presentation going over the benefits of exercise, and those were closed skill modalities. So keep that in mind. This is not bad. Do not villainize closed skills. But there's an opportunity to integrate open skills that we're currently not leveraging. It's usually conducted in a dynamic environment. And I'm going to explain the variables, but you'll see this in martial arts, in sports, in dance, and some other things as well. It's usually associated with object manipulation. The space parameters are not fixed. The time parameters are not fixed. It's usually associated with group performance. There's another person there. This is often seen in sports or martial arts or dance. There's high inter-trial variability, which essentially means it's unpredictable. There's a lot of variety. And there's simultaneous oppositional performance. So as you get better, your opponent gets better. There's a lot of studies being conducted on exergaming or virtual reality, and those types of technologies are adaptive. As you get better, the game gets better. And then it's usually associated with a dual task or a multitask condition, which is sort of what we're going to propose for integrating cognitive stimuli into your sessions. Now, these 2 things are on a continuum. A lot of people say it's either this or this. That's not the case. These things are on a continuum. So it goes from open to closed, and what you do could be a plot point anywhere on that continuum. What we're looking to do is have as many plot points as possible throughout that continuum, because variability is key, we think, for health. This is the gold mine right here. This is a graphic that we have developed over the course of several months. looking at over 50 research papers to summarize the effects of different modalities of exercise on the brain. So we'll go into detail, we'll zoom in on each of these brain structures and talk about the types of activities and modalities that may be associated with activating this part of the brain. Now, I will say the issue with this approach in this graphic is that certain parts of the brain that we're basing this off of have more research than others, and more research always needs to be done. And then the regional approach, targeting brain region by brain region, isn't so much relevant anymore. It's still valid, but now we're moving towards more functional brain networks. If people have heard of the default mode network or the central executive network or the somatosensory network, we're not going to go over networks in this presentation, but we do in our course, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation as well. But functional brain networks are another way to look at the interrelationships between regions, because sometimes multiple regions are turned on for a single activity. So it's not like a switching on and off. If you've heard of that myth, you only use, 10% of your brain? That's BS. That's not true at all. Your brain works in networks, and that's modulated by different levels of activity. So let's go through this. Let's start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is associated with executive functions. You've probably heard of the prefrontal cortex. And this isn't comprehensive, but we tried. It usually will be more active and grow in response to cognitively demanding activities, open skill activities, which we went over, resistance training, and mind-body exercise. Now, when you see resistance training, you're like, wait a minute, what about meatheads? Where did that come from? Well, it's very interesting. A researcher named Teresa Lou Ambrose from University in Vancouver has led the charge in researching the cognitive effects of resistance training. She actually presents resistance training as a form of cognitive training. Now, quick quiz question. What kind of resistance training is likely to be better for the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobes? Things where you have to learn a skill like Olympic lifting or machines? Right, because it's skill-oriented. It requires more cognitive resources, paying attention. If you're distracted, you could hurt yourself. But machines, they're more close skill. They're not bad, they're great, but they're more close skill. Do we want to do one or the other, or a combination of the two? Combination of the two, because variability is king or queen. Variability is gender neutral. Okay, so with these activities, we have increased gray matter, potentially improved executive functions, and potentially more efficient brain activity. The parietal lobes. When you hear about the somatosensory cortex, Dr. Chris Thompson presented on this yesterday. It's usually associated with the parietal lobes, associated with sensory-rich activities, visuospatial demands, object-based activities. Where are you likely to find these? Things like sports, usually things that require an implement, tennis, baseball, pickleball. Increased white matter and volume, increased sensory network activity, and improved task switching abilities, which is excellent to hear given that what we went over earlier is that task switching is an attentional ability that declines with age. You remember that? Okay, occipital lobe, going to be active during visual spatial demands, visual attention demands, and demands of motor control and stimulation. When we have that, we have increased white and gray matter, improved visual skills and attention, and increased volume of function of this region. Now, we actually have a special guest today that's an expert in this and the parietal lobes. His name is Dave. Dave, will you please stand up? Dave is a pickleball champion. He's here for the senior games. Let's give him a hand. Now, Dave, he'll sign pickleballs afterwards. Now, Dave, I can't see your brain. You're a beautiful man, but I can't see your brain. But I can only imagine that you have some good stuff going on in the occipital lobe. In fact, the research that we based this off of, the title of the paper was Masters Athletes Have Greater Occipital Lobe Volume Than Those Who Are Sedentary of the Same Age. So I think that would be you, sir. Congratulations. We're excited to see you perform. You are an occipital lobe champion. I want you to know that. Right. How do you like my open skill abilities now, right? That's what you can say. Thank you. So then we have the temporal lobes. And the temporal lobes house the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a deeper brain structure. And that grows with cardiovascular exercise, we know that. Closed skill activities, but also open skill activities. The hippocampus is very sensitive to changes from exercise. And there's some interesting theories as to why that is. People think the hippocampus just isn't responsible for learning and memory, because oftentimes aerobic exercise is not a learning and memory task. So why would it grow? And there's some interesting theories that the hippocampus is actually also functioning as a sensory organ that modulates the intensity of activity. How interesting is that? That it might be a sensory organ associated with the intensity of movement. And so that's probably why cardiovascular exercise, or one of the reasons cardiovascular exercise might improve its size. And of course, just generalized physical activity. We look at the walking studies that show improvements in hippocampal volumes over time. So increased learning and memory, improved neurogenesis, and increased hippocampal volumes. And then we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is very interesting. Some studies say it houses over 50% of the brain's neurons, very neuron-dense region of the brain. It's going to be activated with coordinative exercise, open skill activities, and activities that include skill and motor learning. When we do those types of activities over periods of months and years, we're likely to have increased cerebellar volume and function, improved coordination and attention, and greater nerve cell and blood vessel volume. Not shown here is another deeper brain structure called the basal ganglia, which is associated, its dysfunction is associated with Parkinson's disease, as you may have heard, and similar mechanisms also occur in the basal ganglia, specifically for motor fitness and coordinative fitness. Now, the cognitive stimulation hypothesis is one that we're talking about today, and there are several researchers that discuss it, Tomporovsky, Best, Pesce, Diamond, and they say that coordinative and cognitively demanding activities are likely to impact executive functions more than aerobic exercise alone. So remember, executive functions, they're housed in that prefrontal cortex, and they include planning, organizing, working memory, and they modulate the function of other cognitive functions like attention, processing speed. So it's the CEO of the brain. So if we want to improve those, and many of those decline with age, if we want to improve those, we need more cognitively demanding and coordinatively demanding exercise, typically in combination with aerobic exercise. So the factors that we need are unpredictability, goal-directed attention, discovery and curiosity, enjoyment and socialization. There's a lot of interesting research being done on the effects of enjoying the process of what you're doing on executive functions. There's research where they've taken a group doing Taekwondo that enjoyed it and a group that did not. The group that did not actually decreased in their executive functions. The group that did improved. So enjoyment, we're looking at volumes and intensities and sets and reps. What about enjoyment levels? Why aren't we measuring or planning for that? And then socialization, of course, constant and dynamic challenge. And if we look at these, they seem to be synonymous with that open skill category we were talking about, right? Are you starting to see the relationships and the common threads here? Now let's talk about neurotransmitters. And we're going to talk about neurotransmitters not just as an effect of exercise, but why cognitive engagement during exercise might further facilitate better brain benefits. So we have something called attention-enhanced neurogenesis, which means the neurogenesis is enhanced when you're paying attention. So there's larger changes in plasticity occurring during hard, focused work and goal-directed tasks. So what that means is when you're focused and engaged and you're working hard, you're challenged, and you're enjoying the process, you're likely to have an upregulation and neuroplastic changes. Now let's think of the average person going to the gym, especially on their own, and they get on the exercise bike. What do you think they're doing? They're either watching TV or spacing out or reading the newspaper. That's not always the case, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if we want to capitalize on the opportunity of attention-enhanced neurogenesis, that's probably not what we would do. And have you ever had that client where you're giving them instructions for a task and they're just spacing out? Or they're on the machine and they're kind of looking out and their eyes are moving? They're not focused on the goal at hand or the task at hand. So effortless tasks or tasks that are irrelevant or unimportant have the opposite effect. Now, that doesn't mean that mastery of a task isn't beneficial. It means that mastery of tasks is usually associated with effortlessness. And effortlessness reflects a strong myelination of pathways. The myelin's those oligodendrocytes that wrap around the nerves, and the myelin provides that nice insulation to speed that neural signal up. When we have effortless tasks, we've had to go through a lot of neural changes and benefits to get there, But once we've achieved that, it's probably time to start something new and go back to our open skills to have more novel, engaging, and challenging tasks as well. Now, acetylcholine is a very important neurotransmitter because its dysfunction is associated with Alzheimer's disease. Now, I'm not saying by stimulating more acetylcholine, you're going to reverse Alzheimer's disease, but it's a very important neurotransmitter, and we'll talk about why. It has a stronger release when paying attention or under the circumstances of novel stimuli, and it specializes cortical activity in region-specific plasticity based on specific input. Let me break that down for you. Remember when we went over the brain region specificity, this task is likely to address the cerebellum. This task is likely to address the frontal cortex. Well, what happens is if we have a lot of attention and novelty, neuroplasticity will occur, but acetylcholine will further modulate or mediate that process of input-specific stimuli. Does that make sense? It's the escort to target different domains of cognitive functioning or the escort to target specific brain regions or networks. I find that fascinating. And then acetylcholine also improves learning, memory, and attention. I think someone rolled their eyes. Why do you find that fascinating? It's because I'm lonely. That's why. I'm very lonely, and that's the only reason why I find that fascinating. Noradrenaline and dopamine are released with novel, engaging, and unexpected stimuli. And the surprise factor that is associated with novelty increases learning in dopamine, and dopamine facilitates BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, even further. So it behooves us to understand when these are released. You're seeing the trend, novel, engaging, attention-oriented, right? This is complex, but those takeaways aren't that hard. We start to see that open skill exercises where we're really paying attention, it's novel stimuli, it's dynamically changing. That's not what we want all the time, but it's probably not what we're integrating into our sessions right now. We could probably use more of that. And those neurotransmitters also interact, but we're not going to go into that. That's a bit more complex. Now, we talk about this metaphor called the volume knobs of these cognitive domains. So there's memory, attention, executive functioning, which we've defined, and processing speed. And we'll talk about what types of tasks are likely to engage these different domains. Now, these volume knobs are always on. Think of a DJ. He has all 4 of his volume knobs on. It's not like you turn one off completely during any task. They're always on. But if we had, let's just say, a 1 out of 20, it went from 1 out of 20, we could maybe even put this theoretical number on what types of tasks are likely to turn up these volume knobs differentially, depending on the demands, the cognitive demands of that task. And this is completely theoretical, but there's more research pointing to domain-specific cognitive training, and then taking that even further, domain specificity during dual tasking or combined cognitive physical exercise. So it's helpful to keep these in mind, and in our course, we give this to you as a printout, so you can even have it on your clipboard or with you while you're having clients going through tasks that you're replicating or making up. And you can also use it to analyze other activities they may be going through. So what are the programming elements that an exercise and physical activity plan focused on brain health, what should it have? It should have ultimately it's variability. I'm spoiling the ending for you, but let's break it down a little bit more in detail. You're going to have cardiovascular exercise, a combination of steady state and interval training. A lot of research shows moderate intensity, steady state exercise tends to yield the best cognitive benefits, but that's just because we haven't done too much more research on the other modalities of low intensity and high intensity. There's a lot more research being done now and being published now on high intensity interval training, and there's some really good research showing that high intensity interval training is more likely to improve processing speed, and that makes sense because you're moving your body faster. We've talked about that theory of the hippocampus being a sensory organ for modulating the intensity of effort or exercise. So that theory might have some validity there. Then we have resistance training. We talked about the difference or some examples of resistance training that's closed skill versus open skill. So we want a combination of the linear kind of fixed position machine type exercise and the open skill, unconventional skill-based resistance training as well. And of course, we want some motor and coordination training, which is mostly associated with this open skill domain. And that includes neuromotor training, mind-body exercise like Tai Chi, yoga, Qigong, martial arts, and leisure time or physical activity. And that can include sports like golf, tennis, pickleball, hiking, things of that regard. So your exercise and physical activity plan should have a combination of these things. So what we like to do in our intake process with our clients is we check off what they're currently doing so that we see what they currently don't have. And we put that in a plan over several months, and we talk about how to progress towards doing the things they're currently not doing at that time. So we're moving towards variability. What is not necessarily or explicitly included here is cognitive physical training or dual tasking, or combined cognitive physical training and dual tasking. Now let's define dual tasking. It's not the same thing as multitasking. Dual tasking is a combination of one simultaneous cognitive and physical task, or one cognitive and one physical task at the same time. An example would be driving or getting something out of your purse while you're walking. This also declines with age. Dual task ability declines with age. And so you've probably heard of different assessments like the timed up and go, or there's different balance assessments. And in physical therapy especially, they're doing those assessments while under a dual task condition. So the timed up and go cognitive involves sitting in a chair. There's a cone 8 feet out. When they say go, they stand up, they walk around the cone, they sit down, time, how many seconds did it take you, and there's normative ranges for that. The tug cognitive is the trainer or the professional picks a number at random between 20 and 100, and they have to count backwards by threes as they do that task, and then you time them. It sounds really, really hard, but because of the dual task trade-off, they're likely to be slower on the physical task. But here's what's interesting. With practice of dual task ability, they can actually get better at the tug cognitive and faster than the tug itself. So if you can train your clients to be able to do that in your facilities or in your sessions, you're training them in a way that's much harder than the tasks they'll encounter in the real world, which means they're much likely to fall, or much less likely to fall. They're much less likely to get hurt. They're much more likely to have improved cognitive abilities over time, especially in activities of daily living. However, I will say that if the cognitive task is too challenging, we'll talk about cognitive and physical trade-off, you can actually increase the chance that someone falls. So we'll talk about how to gauge that, so you're not just giving them a really hard task cognitively during a really hard task physically. You want them to be competent in the physical movement first before you add a cognitive task on top of that. Okay. So let's go over those different types of cognitive tasks. We looked at the volume knobs, attention, memory, executive function, and processing speed. So what are attention tasks likely to include? Well, it's going to include attending to sensory stimuli. And that could mean myriad things, but it could be audible cues, visual cues, external cues. It could be other sensory cues like proprioceptive cues as well. And even if it's not a proprioceptive cue, just proprioceptive input, if the direction is to pay attention to that, that might be more of an internal focus. And research has shown that an external focus improves motor learning and performance, but it doesn't mean that an internal focus is bad. We need interoception. We need the ability to feel our sensations in our senses as well and make sense of them. And the parietal lobe, if you recall, integrates all that sensory information and makes meaning of it. So attention is just attending to those senses. Memory tasks, and this probably makes more sense than you think, but it includes routines, procedures, steps, complex instructions, rules, choreography. And so you're going to see that in sports, in motor learning, in dance, in Tai Chi, in yoga. You're going to see this in a lot of variety of modalities. But what's interesting is that we typically don't mix up the choreography or rules at a rate that would be conducive to better brain health or cognitive demands. Usually the goal is to master the choreography or to master the steps. But remember, we talked about effortlessness not necessarily being the most conducive to cognitive health over time. Also, the visual recall of locations or the verbal recall of things like lists, numbers, letters, etc. Now, processing speed task is also pretty straightforward. It includes the higher temporal or speed demands. So if I throw a ball at you really fast, that's a bit more of a processing speed demand. Now, how fast any movement is executed based on visual, auditory, and other sensory cues can be reflective of processing speed. So processing speed is the foundation of many of these cognitive functions. And when we talk about white matter, there's something called the white matter aging theory, and that's associated with a general slowing of sensory cues and neuronal signals. So training processing speed is really important. In fact, processing speed is one of the main markers that is indicative of cognitive decline. It's not the only one you want to test, but it's associated with that cognitive trajectory. It's very predictive of other types of cognitive performance. Then we have executive function tasks: organizing, planning, directing, reasoning, problem solving, working memory, impulse control. Typically trained in open skill, novel, enjoyable, social, and/or challenging tasks or modalities. And then when we talk about motor learning, there's different phases. There's the cognitive phase of learning, which is associated with a lot of mistakes and sometimes frustrations, which we'll talk about how to gauge, so your clients don't get too frustrated with these types of tasks. And then it goes all the way up to that effortless or masterful stage of learning. But we want to stay in that cognitive phase of learning. And typically when we graduate from that, we manipulate variables or add in new tasks to get them back into that cognitive phase of learning. Okay, so how do we gauge the ideal state of this dual task trade-off, this cognitive physical trade-off? So I'm sure many of you have heard of the flow state. We have task difficulty, and we have skills. So task difficulty, how difficult is the task? And then skills, how skilled are they in the task? If the task difficulty is too low and their skills are too high, so if I gave you something that you could do really easily and you're just really good at that task, you're likely to have boredom, routine, or loss of interest, which is not what we want. And then if it's too hard relative to their skill level, maybe they haven't developed the skills or we progress too quickly, they're likely to have anxiety, frustration, or fear of failure. I have this all the time at the Brain Health Center where we introduce new tasks and there's this fear, oh, I'm not good at that. Well, you haven't done it yet, how do you know, right? And it's just there's general bias that they're not going to be good at it. And it kind of comes from this fear of cognitive decline and performance on cognitive tasks. It also comes from our test-taking society. We're really focused on the performance of that test. Now, if you have an optimal relationship between task difficulty and skills, you have the flow state. It's an optimal balance. And I have a great graphic, I didn't show it here unfortunately, that shows the different phases of the flow state are associated with differential releases in types of neurotransmitters. So things like the dopamine and the acetylcholine are likely to be released in those states of flow. And afterward, you even get this release of anandamide, which has been called the bliss hormone. So you feel really good that you accomplished something challenging, and that brings you a lot of mental health benefits as well. It's kind of that feel-good hormone, similar to oxytocin. Now, how do we actually measure the nature of the cognitive task they may be engaging in? It could be a pickleball match. It could be a cognitive task that I gave them. Maybe I had them do the timed up and go, counting backwards by threes, whatever it may be. But how do we actually gauge that? So this is something called the NASA Task Load Index, or the NASA TLX. It was actually developed by NASA, which makes it sound way cooler than it actually is. And just like, yeah, I'm using a tool from NASA. Like, were you an astronaut? No, it's pretty cool. And so there's 6 different measures. You'll see 3 here and 3 here. We'll go through the first 3 that I think are the most relevant. Now, you'll see it has very low or very high, and there's actually 21 points here. It's a 21-point Likert scale, but I actually just say 1 through 10 to simplify it for myself and my clients. And so we have mental demand. How mentally demanding was the task? Was it very low, very high, very low equaling 1, very high equaling 10? So if it was a 10, they could barely do it because it was so cognitively demanding. Physical demand, how physically demanding was the task? So was it metabolically challenging? Was the coordination part of it challenging? If there was resistance, was there too much tension? Temporal demand, how hurried or rushed was the pace of the task? And that's what we want to know because that's related to processing speed. If they're really hurrying or rushing, that could of course lead to frustration, but we also want to know, was this hurried? If they were taking their time, it's less likely that processing speed was there. It's less likely that speed was a demand. So we want to see that temporal demand. And then this is more of the psychological side, I would say, is how successful were you in accomplishing what you were asked to do? So if I asked you to do the timed up and go cognitive assessment, how successful were you in accomplishing that? Was it perfect or was it failure? And this is another place where I think clients really, really lowball themselves. They say, oh, I did terrible. I'm like, you were way above the average in this normative range. What are you talking about? So having part of the psychological side is really having them give a successful predictor of their performance. And then effort, how hard did you have to work to accomplish your level of performance? How much effort did they have to put forth? I guess you could say that's quite synonymous with RPE, or rate of perceived exertion in some ways. And then frustration, how insecure, discouraged, irritated, stressed, or annoyed were you? I'm like at a 10 all the time. But essentially you want to know, did this task frustrate them? And if the task is too frustrating, what do you think is going to happen? Will they want to come back to you? Will they be excited for the next task? Probably not. Are they going to buy in to what you're trying to tell them or do for them? Probably not. Now, the hard part about this is that the cognitive phase of motor learning is associated with making mistakes. And what happens when people make mistakes? they're likely to be frustrated, right? And so we have to control for that factor because we want them to have this positive affect, yet we want them to have challenge and learn from their mistakes. So it's a really intense balance of those two things, and it's a constant thing you need to be aware of. And usually, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but I think I did a great session for my client. I think they did great. I'm trying to read them and read their body language and their facial expressions. Like, oh, they're liking this. And then at the very end, they might tell someone else or tell me directly that they didn't really enjoy it, right? You think they really enjoyed it, but you didn't actually gauge it. And it's kind of awkward to ask, well, are you liking this? Of course they're going to say it. They're not going to say, no, you suck. They're not going to say that. So using this kind of takes the stigma away from that conversation. It kind of neutralizes that conversation and makes it very objective or data-based, right? Now, I know what you're thinking. How do I have time to sit down after every exercise or modality and go through this with them? Well, you don't. And I'm going to explain how I sort of streamline the use of this in session. And you might even do it rating the session as a whole. You might rate an activity like tennis or hiking as a whole, and you can use that to modify the variables in either the modality, the specific technique, or the exercise session itself. So this allows you to modify variables like intensity, frequency, duration, cognitive demand, physical demand. And what's really interesting is that if we think about dual task trade-off, it's a trade-off between mental and physical demand. And of course, if you give them a cognitive task that's too demanding, yes, they're likely to go slower, but primarily I'm interested in the relationship between those two. Because if the cognitive task is too demanding, why are they exercising with you? You're supposed to be an exercise professional. If the physical task was too demanding and the cognitive task was too low, well, then we're missing out on that opportunity. What you want is sort of a nice balance. It doesn't have to be 5 and 5. It can be a 5 to 7, a 5 to 7. And sometimes you want to give them tasks that are just more physically demanding, maybe a resistance training exercise because you're trying to achieve physical goals as well. But ideally, we want to balance between these two. Now, most often what happens is we're either on the very low or the very high side, and let me explain why. We talked about that less cognitively demanding modality of exercise, like being on the bike while watching TV or lifting weights on the machine. It's not like those don't have cognitive demands. You're not a vegetable while you're doing those things. There has to be some activation of your brain and your neurophysiology and your cognitive demands while you're undergoing those things. So you're not asleep. So it's not something that we're villainizing. It's not saying that there's no cognitive demands. It's just there's less than the ones that we're trying to target and less than the ones found in sports, martial arts, and dance, for example. So what happens is it's either very low in that example or it's very high. And I see a lot of people trying to integrate the concept of dual tasking or multitasking or combined cognitive physical training in our industry that do it with really good intentions, but they end up just giving you a really hard task, and then you're not even moving anymore. That's not the point. The point is to have a balance of these two. If I wanted a high cognitive task and a low cognitive physical demand, I do brain games or go to school, right? We're not doing this just to stimulate their mental demands. That's not why we're doing this. We're doing this to have a nice balance between the two because the physical part feeds the neurobiological mechanisms required for those enhanced benefits. Remember the neuron chart with the MAP training, the MAP, the mental and physical training? In order to get that, we need a nice trade-off of the two. Not just demands where you're sitting there and thinking really hard, and not just exercise where you're not thinking at all. We want to balance between the two. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's why this is important. And so sometimes you'll give them a task, ooh, this one's really hard, right? And then you find out, oh, it wasn't that demanding. So this is really valuable information, okay? All right, so I know I went through a lot. You're probably thinking, I want to go back to this information and study it some more. And you're probably thinking, dude, where are the cognitive physical exercises themselves? Well, for this talk, we didn't have enough time to demonstrate a bunch of different examples of how I would do this in an exercise session. And there's a lot to learn about the neurobiology of exercise. There's a lot to learn of how to combine cognitive and physical tasks together. But I hope today I've given you enough information to be creative with your own stuff and to just take existing modalities that you know about, like Tai Chi or martial arts or dance or sports, and take techniques from those modalities and incorporate them into your sessions. And I know many of you are integrating these brain games already, and use the tools I presented here to measure them from the NASA Task Load Index perspective and modify them so you hit that nice balance. And I even gave you the volume knobs, the memory, attention, processing speed, and executive functioning. So you can try your hand at starting to categorize different things they're doing in different modalities or specific techniques under that, and seeing how much are those volume knobs turned up. If I have a feeling that my client needs more memory challenges, how do I do that? And in our course, the Brain Health Trainer course, we give you an intake packet that allows you to assess certain abilities subjectively. It's not clinically valid, but it helps to start the conversation and give things in these different cognitive abilities an objective measure. And I don't want to pat myself on the back too much, but the Brain Health Trainer course is about to be launched in 2 weeks. We're announcing it here, and it's in collaboration with FAI. It's going to be an FAI course, just like the Functional Aging Specialist or the Tai Chi course. And this is the first comprehensive certification in brain health ever. This does not exist, and we're really excited to share this with you guys. And what we're hoping is that we can move towards training those 300,000 trainers with 30 clients each and affecting 9 million people suffering from cognitive decline, so that we can help stop this burden of cognitive decline, or at least slow it and stop it in its tracks a little bit, right? And so if you're passionate about doing that and adding this skill set to your practice and really helping people at a deeper level and being able to talk about this with confidence, to talk about the brain and talk about exercise with confidence, and even start making changes to your exercise and physical activity plans to reflect goals of cognitive functioning or brain health, this is why we created this course. You can go to the Brain Health Trainer website at www.brainhealthtrainer.com. That will take you straight to the landing page to sign up. If you want to contact me directly for more questions or a client case that you have or questions about the course, you can go to ryanglatt.com, and there's a contact form there that will go straight to my email, and I will follow up with you in due time. And for the course, we have special pricing for pre-con attendees. So when you sign up at the Brain Health Trainer website, you will be notified when the pre-sales page launches, and of course you will be notified when the course itself launches. And this pricing will not happen again. This is just for early adopters and specifically for FAI Summit attendees. I said pre-con here. There's a different price for pre-con attendees if you attended my pre-con. For Summit attendees, there's also special pricing. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. And thank you for your passion for brain health and exercise and helping individuals potentially suffering from cognitive decline. I think together we can really do some damage on this burden of cognitive decline and neurodegenerative disease. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.